There are times in the story of Jesus, you'll find in the New Testament, where Jesus seemingly becomes unhinged, goes off the rails. He loses it. And this is one of those moments. This is one of those situations. Now, I think we need to be careful, though, we don't compare our moments of losing it with Jesus's. Because in this moment, when Jesus kind of seemingly lost it, he actually wasn't out of control. He was very much in control. See, the problem is when our emotion takes over, we end up losing control. Then we end up saying and doing things we regret that are sinful, but not Jesus. What this was actually was a deep passion in him. It was a passion for what is right, because what Jesus saw happening in the temple was not right. And so I think it's important that we don't look at moments when Jesus kind of becomes unhinged and think that that's a reason for us to do things that are seemingly unhinged, because I've heard sometimes Christians who will use moments like this and they'll kind of say, well, see, if Jesus can flip over tables, that's what we need to do because our culture has just lost it. And man, I'm just going to go flip some tables. Can I just remind you something? You're not Jesus, and I'm not Jesus. And if I flip a table, I guarantee you I've sinned, okay? And by the way, I think sometimes I've heard people use this terminology for things that they want to do for those who are outside the church. Can I remind you where Jesus was when he flipped the tables over? He was inside the temple. So this was not about the culture. This is not about the world. This is him addressing a problem within the church. There's a difference. And so Jesus goes to the temple. Now you got to understand the temple was a sacred place for the Jewish people. The temple, in their eyes, represented the house of God. This was the one place where you could meet with God through a priest. But this was like God's blessing and his favor on their people was at the temple. This was the house of God. This was the place that you came when you had guilt in your life for messing up, breaking commands, hurting someone. You came and you brought an offering and you gave an animal. They sacrificed it on your behalf. The priest blessed you, and then all of a sudden you could be right with God. This is what the temple represented. Yet when Jesus walked into the temple, he sees something that sets him off. Well, the Passover was a time, in fact, one of 3 times every year where people traveled from all over to Jerusalem, the epicenter of the Jewish faith, and then they would go to the temple, where in the temple they would bring a sacrifice. Now, if you remember the Passover, it was a reflected moment of what God did bringing the Israelites out of Egypt when God had them kill a lamb, put it over the doorposts of their homes, and therefore God did not come and take the firstborn, but passed over. So this is something they've been celebrating for hundreds of years. The Passover. And so Jesus does what you're always supposed to do, and he goes to the temple. And here's what's interesting is I'm thinking about this moment and realizing this is the beginning of his ministry. Why in the world would you start out your ministry creating enemies like this? But Jesus did. Think about this. This is not the way to build a base. This is not a good way to build your platform. This is not a great way to kind of gain popularity. But here's the thing we'll discover about Jesus. He didn't care about popularity. He cared about what was right. I love that about Jesus. If you're like, I'm not sure about church and all that, that's fine. Stick around. Let's talk about Jesus. I bet you'll like him. Now, God did create a system, a sacrificial system, because God is perfect and holy, and when we sin, there's something that separates us, and so God had created a system that was a placeholder so that we could actually get connected back to the Father. It was about this connection and relationship, okay? But what we have now in the religious system of Jesus' day is a perversion of what God intended. Can I just tell you, it wasn't just back then, but it still exists today. Even in the modern church, we have still created factions. We've created things that separate. We've created areas that create barriers for people. We've kind of said, if you look a certain way, you're welcome here. Or we've seen segregation in the church based on your skin color, based on your theological beliefs, based on your social class, based on all these things that have, and all God's heart has always been, I want my people to come to me. But what religion does is it creates barriers along the way. And so Jesus walks into this place where everybody's showing up. to celebrate the Passover. I mean, there's a significance to this moment. And he walks into this place and he sees that Jewish people from maybe hundreds of miles who traveled to honor God, to maybe it's the only time, maybe once, twice, 3 times a year where they actually feel like they can be close to the presence of God. Might be the only time they can feel like they're right with God. I don't know if some of you know what it's like, but when I mess up and when I've sinned, like there's a weight that comes with it. There's a guilt, there's a shame. And I wonder how many people have been carrying that for maybe months, and now they have their opportunity. And when they get in there and they need a sacrifice because you didn't walk into the presence of God, you didn't show up empty-handed, but you come with a sacrifice. The moment they do that, I walk up and there's these people that are selling sheep and cattle. God knew that there were people that didn't have a lot. Like to sacrifice a sheep might be like, they don't have very much. It might be everything. It might be what their family's going to eat, you know. And so here's what God did, and I love this. This is, again, what was God's heart? I'm just trying to show you something today. Just something real simple, okay? His heart was, I don't want to make it hard for people who want to come to me. That's his heart. And so God allowed them, if they could not afford one of those 4-legged animals, he would allow them to be able to sacrifice pigeon or a turtle dove. I think when he saw the doves, he really got mad, because that was them extorting the poor who just want to come and get right with God. You understand why he got so angry? And so here's what religion does. Religion as a system, through all these systems, it ends up kind of like creating layers and rules and things that keep us further away from God. And it sets up all these barriers. And I think the moment Jesus saw all these barriers, he realized it's not what God intended, and these barriers are now have become a business. We're going to make money on your sin. Going to make money on your failure, going to make money on your need to connect with God. And that messed him up. He was so incensed that he became unhinged. And here's the thing when it comes to religion. Religion always creates barriers to God. What do I mean by that? Because some of you are going, well, aren't you guys religious? Isn't this a religion? Technically, but I don't see it that way. I know you could just say semantics, but I actually don't see it that way. See, here's what religion does. Religion says that if you act a certain way, perform a certain way, talk a certain way, don't say certain words, don't do certain things, then God accepts you, then God will love you, then you can be part of the community. That's what religion does. But here's what I know. God's heart has never been about religion. And I think sometimes people confuse religion with the church. And I think there's a huge difference between religion and having an authentic relationship with your Father in heaven. In my mind, see, here's the problem. In my mind, I see it different. And I think maybe, and I get it, in the eyes of those who are outside the church, it's all just religion. But for those of us who may be a part of this community, I hope you see it differently, because Jesus saw it differently. And when he walks in and he sees something that angers him, can I tell you what I believe as I read through the scriptures about Jesus? You know the thing that I believe angered him more than anything else? It was a religious spirit, a religious attitude, a self-righteous, pious attitude that people think I'm better than others because I follow more rules. In fact, every place you see in Scripture where he becomes unhinged, it's always dealing with religious people. You would think that maybe it would be some of the other things that would offend him. You would think that, that adulterous woman, she was caught in the middle of it and brought to Jesus. What should we do with her? Should we stone her? And Jesus is like, well, whoever's Without sin, go ahead and throw the first stone. And they all drop them. And then he looks at her and he says, where's your condemners? And she says, there are none. He says, well, neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. He was a God of grace and truth. He gave both when he saw people, but it was the love. You would think that he would be most bothered by the tax collectors who were taking money from their own people. No, Jesus would go to the house of a tax collector. He would hang out and have dinner with all of them and invited one of them to be on his team. No, you would think that those are the people that would make Jesus so angry. But it wasn't. It was those with a religious spirit that angered him. I wish those of you, and maybe some of you are here today and you say, I'm not sure what I believe. I'm glad you're here because I need you to hear this. The thing that makes God so incredibly mad in the Gospels wasn't the sin. See, the sin, we think it makes God mad. No, what it does, it actually separates us from him. It breaks his heart. The thing that makes him mad is the religious attitude where we forget how much we really need him. In fact, I would go so far, and I want to say something that this is where it'll probably get a little confrontational, especially if you've been in church for a while. But I kind of felt like that was my assignment today, so forgive me. But I actually think when we talk about our spiritual journey, I actually think the most dangerous place to be is in the church, but far from God. I actually think that's the most dangerous place to live in. Because some of you, like me, you've been in church maybe your whole life. And what happens is when you're in an environment for so long, you can become really comfortable in that environment. And here's the danger. We can become comfortable in our own sin. We can have tables set up in our life and think it's not a problem with God. That we can be so close to God in proximity of being in his presence and yet somehow not being uncomfortable when we bring our sin into his presence. And I think the longer that you're around the church environment, the easier it is to become religious and self-righteous. And I think it's a warning to us. I'm talking to those of you that have been in church with me for a long time. Because I wonder how many tables that we've set up, that we've allowed in our life. And I wonder what Jesus would do about them today. I've got a question for you. And I'd love for you to write this question down. It's the only thing I want you to remember from today. You can forget all of what I said. I don't care if you'll remember this one question. Because I want this question to sit with you this week. I've been wrestling with this, and it's not easy to answer. The longer you're in church, the harder it is to answer this question. And I think it's something that really should haunt us a little bit if we're really comfortable in church. And it's this question: what would Jesus flip over in my life? What would Jesus flip over in my life? Well, I don't know, Pastor. I'm really just following the 10 Commandments, and I'm just, really, I show up and go to church every single week, and I've been giving a tithe, and I'm glad. That's great. I love all that. But I'm asking you, what would Jesus flip in your life? I wonder if he would love to step into the church today and flip over the table of gossip. Because we are so comfortable sitting in church and never feeling a little bit guilty about gossiping about others in the community, cutting down others in the community, saying things about other people behind their back. Oh no, I come and I'll sing all the songs and raise my hands and clap and I'll shout the pastor down, and then I'm gonna go talk about, oh, can you believe her? And I can't believe that they did that. And I'll do this. Listen, and then here's the sad part, is that we can show up every single week and we can be in this community and never even realize we have a table that Jesus wants to flip over. I think he'd flip some of those tables over, don't you? I know it's a little bit in your face, isn't it? I wonder if he'd flip over how we handle our money, our resources. Well, it's mine. I'm in control. Jesus is like, You think you are? Let me flip that table over and we'll see how you like it. What would he flip over? Is it a relationship that you're in that is not honoring God? Let me say it this way, because I don't want you to confuse this. A dating relationship that's not honoring God. You're doing things that's not honoring God, and you know it, and you've even felt like, I'm not supposed to be in this relationship, but you haven't broken it off. But I can show up and worship like there's nothing wrong, but God's speaking to me, and His Spirit's leading me in a new direction. See, I think that, and this, I'm just speaking, I'm in this too, guys. The longer you've been in church, the easier it is to leave tables set up that He would love to flip over. And then point at everybody who's not in the room and say they're the problem. No. Jesus, He came to flip our tables in the church. And I know we don't like this, and it gets quiet, and I'm okay with quiet today. I'm okay with that. Because I think flipping makes us uncomfortable. I get it. But I actually think the most dangerous place to be is when you can sit in church and be absolutely comfortable with your tables. That He says, I want to flip that over. Because we don't even realize, but the tables that we've set up, they might be a barrier for you connecting with God and a barrier for somebody else to connect with God. A legalistic mindset. I can't believe it, I just think, what would He want to flip? That's the question I just want us to sit with today. That's all. And if your reaction to any of these things are, preacher, you should back up. If you're like, I like it when we preach about grace and we preach about stuff that we can all shout and holler about. Oh, I do too, but I actually think sometimes the greatest work happens when we get confronted with something that we need to deal with that's keeping us from God. I actually think that's the greatest work that happens in us. And our response, that's why I'm trying to make this a little bit uncomfortable. Why? Because we've become so comfortable. Our response dictates whether or not we have a religious spirit or a humble spirit. We have one or two options when the Spirit of God confronts a table in our life. We can sit on it. You ain't flipping this, or you can let Him flip it. Let Him flip it. Some of us, we just need to let God flip it. And if you wonder why I think Jesus got so angry in this moment, I think if you zoom out, you'll actually see Jesus knew what the Passover was really about. See, He was here celebrating the Passover. But Jesus knew that He came to be our Passover lamb. He knew it. I think one of the reasons why He got so angry is because the system they had at the time for being made right with God, it was the thing that they had. Religion, man, leaders had stepped in and created more layers and rules and barriers and traditions that kept people further from God. And Jesus knew what He came to do, which was offer His life and offer Himself as the sacrifice. And so He's thinking to Himself, the last thing I want is some other man keeping people from coming to God when I'm giving my life for it. And I believe that moment at the beginning of His ministry actually pointed to what would happen 3 years later. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but this wasn't the only time Jesus went through the temple and cleansed it. John tells us He did it at the beginning of the ministry. The other gospel, the synoptic gospel writers, tells us He did it at the end of the ministry. Exactly 3 years later, when Jesus goes back to Jerusalem for the last time because it was Passover, and He walked into the temple, guess what? Nothing had changed. They're still selling stuff. When Jesus left, they set the tables back up. That's the worst thing, by the way, that we can do. The worst thing we can do is set the table back up. And they set them back up, and Jesus cleansed them again. And He said, my house will be a house of prayer for all nations. And He said, you have turned it into a den of thieves and robbers. And He had to do it again. Why was He so angry all the time? Because it pointed to what He was going to do with His life, His death. And then He said, I'll prove it. I'll prove the authority when I get out of that grave. Then you'll know. You'll know. So I want to leave us with this challenge. What would Jesus flip in your life? What does he want to flip? We can sit on it, or we can let him flip it. That's what determines whether or not you actually get closer to him.